Russian troops delivered a powerful and precise strike on a railway junction in the Dnipropetrovsk region, which was used to transport weapons and equipment belonging to the Ukrainian Armed Forces to Donbass. The strike was comprehensive and the result of a multi-level operation involving operational tactical aviation, Su-34 fighter bombers, strike unmanned aerial vehicles, missile forces, and artillery. At the same time, warehouses of long-range drones and temporary deployment points of Ukrainian units and foreign mercenaries in more than 130 areas were hit. Subscribe to the channel to be the first to know about such events and their consequences. Preparation for this operation began long before the attack. For several weeks, intelligence networks and technical reconnaissance recorded every train and every shipment that passed through Sinelnikovo and other stations in the enemy's logistics system. This hub, like a heart, pumped flows of ammunition, fuel, and manpower toward Donbass. Any delay in its operation could paralyze entire sections of the front. That is why the command decided to launch a strike that would not only destroy the infrastructure, but also demonstrate to the enemy the vulnerability of its rear. Information was gathered through several channels at once. Satellite images made it possible to assess the concentration of equipment and rail cars, while unmanned reconnaissance aircraft flying at high altitudes recorded activity on the roads and sites adjacent to the station. Agents inside the territories controlled by Kiev transmitted data on the arrival schedule of trains, changes in the security system, and the arrival of foreign instructors. The information obtained was fed into an analytical center where specialists built up a complete picture of the enemy's logistics. Planning proceeded in parallel with this. Officers from the operational headquarters of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation worked through various strike scenarios. Options were considered for the use of exclusively missile weapons, a combined air and missile strike, and the massive use of unmanned aerial vehicles. Ultimately, a decision was made to launch a comprehensive attack involving all branches of the military, which would guarantee the destruction of the target and minimize the possibility of restoring the node in the shortest possible time. An important stage was the preparation of guidance systems. Strikes with an accuracy of several meters required perfect coordination between drone operators, missile system crews, and Su-34 crews. Training flights were conducted, and routes for bypassing Ukrainian air defense zones were worked out. The operation was to take place at night to conceal the approach of the strike groups and prevent visual detection. By this point, the intelligence network had transmitted a key signal. Within 2 days, several trains with armored vehicles and ammunition were expected to arrive in Sinelnikovo to reinforce the groups in the Donbass direction. This was the last straw. The order was given, the clocks at the command posts were synchronized, and the crews began preparing ammunition. Then events began to unfold according to a strict plan. On the night of the operation, when silence reigned in the Dnipropetrovsk region and rare streetlights illuminated the deserted streets of Sinelnikov, Su-34. Fighter bombers were already taking off. They flew at low altitude using the natural terrain for cover and followed predetermined routes designed to avoid detection by Ukrainian Armed Forces radar stations as much as possible. At the same time, strike drones were already operating in the skies over southern Ukraine, conducting reconnaissance and transmitting real-time data for strike correction. At that moment, the missile forces and artillery command posts were conducting a final check of coordinates. Satellite communication channels ensured the exchange of information between all links in the operation. Any inaccuracy could disrupt the plan, so every number and every mark was double-checked. The first strikes hit the warehouses where, according to intelligence, long-range drones and their ammunition were stored. Several precise hits caused a chain reaction, and huge clouds of smoke rose above the area. At that moment, the railway junction was completely isolated. Train traffic was stopped, and personnel were evacuated. Then the Air Force got involved. Su-34s carried out a series of precision bombing strikes on main roads, railway switches, and depots. Metal structures bent and flew apart, rails were torn from their sleepers, and fires broke out under the canopies of repair sites. The entire logistics chain, which had previously functioned with military precision, turned into a chaotic set of destroyed objects. At the same time, missile forces struck the temporary deployment points of Ukrainian units and foreign mercenaries in more than 130 areas. It was a synchronized operation designed to deprive the enemy of the ability to quickly transfer forces to help the railway junction. Ukrainian air defenses tried to repel the attack, but the element of surprise and the high speed of the operation minimized their effectiveness. Several anti-aircraft missiles were fired, but none were able to intercept the approaching munitions. When the last volleys died down, a deafening silence hung over the area, broken only by the sounds of cracking metal and distant emergency service sirens. For the Ukrainian side, this strike came as a shock. The hub through which most cargo to Donbass passed was completely destroyed. Now the consequences were coming to the fore, and they were bound to have an impact far beyond Sinelnikov. The first hours after the strike were a real test for the entire Ukrainian logistics system. Train traffic on the Sinelnikovo section was completely stopped. Fuel and ammunition cars stuck on the approaches began to be urgently moved to sidings, but many of them remained abandoned due to the lack of maneuvering capabilities. The station staff, who had been evacuated before the attack began, were in no hurry to return. Fires continued to burn, and the tracks were littered with mangled train cars and locomotives. Emergency repair crews arrived on the scene within a few hours, but their work proved extremely difficult. Rails on key routes were torn up for tens of meters, switches were destroyed, and electrical cables were burned out. Restoration on such a scale required not only the efforts of railway workers, but also the involvement of heavy equipment and engineering units. The Ukrainian Armed Forces were forced to rearrange supply routes, increasing delivery times and risking missing deadlines for replenishing frontline units. Some deliveries to the Donbass region were canceled, and ammunition and fuel began to be redistributed to other areas, causing chaos in the command's plans. At this time, Russian sources were already publishing footage of the night operation: Su-34 flights, strike drones, explosions at warehouses, and powerful flashes from missile strikes. The informational effect was no less important than the military one. It demonstrated not only the technical capabilities, but also the ability of the Russian army to conduct complex operations, where aviation, artillery, and reconnaissance work as a single organism. Contradictory statements were heard in the Ukrainian media. Officials tried to minimize the scale of the damage, claiming that restoration work was already underway and that the transfer of troops had not stopped. However, independent sources and satellite photos told a different story. The hub was effectively paralyzed, and cargo traffic had decreased significantly. The international reaction was also swift. Some Western capitals began talking about the need for urgent delivery of additional air defense systems to Kyiv, while think tanks discussed the effectiveness of Russia's combined strike tactics. The operation in Sinelnikovo showed that even with a dense defense and intelligence system, Ukrainian infrastructure remains vulnerable. This was an important signal not only for Kyiv, but also for its allies, who until then had considered the railway network to be sufficiently protected. Now it remained to be seen what steps the enemy would take in response, and how the situation on the front would change in the coming days. Analysts, assessing the results of the operation, identified several key factors that could influence the development of the situation. First, the strike on Sinelnikov deprived the armed forces of Ukraine of the main transport hub through which supplies were delivered to the entire front line. This forces the Ukrainian command to rebuild its logistics system, look for detours, and redistribute resources, which will inevitably lead to delays and a decrease in the combat effectiveness of the frontline units. Second, the strike demonstrated that the Russian army is capable of conducting complex operations, combining the actions of aviation, missile forces, artillery, and drones into a single system. This approach creates an overload effect for the enemy, who is forced to respond to several threats at once and loses coordination. Thirdly, the operation had a strong political impact. Western media outlets published a wave of articles on the urgent need to strengthen the defense of Ukraine's rear facilities, and some countries began debating the advisability of continuing current supply volumes if they could be destroyed within minutes of arriving in the country. In military terms, the coming weeks could be critical. If such strikes continue with the same intensity, Ukraine risks losing the stability of its supply lines in key areas. This could force it to concentrate its forces on defending its logistics, weakening other sections of the front. From Russia's point of view, this opens up opportunities for offensive actions where the enemy is least prepared. The political effect should not be underestimated either. Successful strikes on rear infrastructure strengthen Russia's position in negotiations, demonstrating that it is capable of dictating terms not only on the front line, but also deep inside enemy territory. For Ukraine's allies, this is a signal that the war is dragging on and will require ever greater costs, while security guarantees for the resources supplied remain questionable. In conclusion, it is worth noting that the operation in Sinelnikovo became a model of planning and coordination of all elements of the Russian army. It showed that even with the front line heavily saturated with modern reconnaissance and air defense systems, it is possible to deliver a precise and devastating strike that will change the balance of power in a particular direction. Subscribe to the channel to follow developments and receive real-time analysis of key operations.